He carried her. No hesitation. No calculation. No thought about what it might cost him. Daniel Mercer, a widowed single father who hadn't missed a single school pickup in 4 years. A man with $43 in his checking account and a cracked dashboard on his 10-year-old SUV, bent down, slid his arms under the most powerful woman in North Carolina and lifted her off the floor. She told him to put her down. He didn't. She told him she could fire him for this. He said, "Fire me from the hospital." And then he walked through an empty executive hallway, down a service elevator, across a dark parking lot in the middle of a Charlotte rainstorm, and put his billionaire boss in the back seat of a car that still had his daughter's spelling homework on the floor. He drove 8 minutes to Mercy Regional. He carried her inside. He stayed until the surgeon came out at 4 a.m. and told him she was going to live. And when they handed her the emergency contact form, with every Asteron attorney and board member sitting 30 feet away in that waiting room, Claire Whitmore picked up the pen and wrote his name. Not her chairman, not her lawyer. The man in the dirty work uniform. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if this one hits you somewhere real, subscribe to this channel. You don't want to miss what happens next. The storm came in fast that Tuesday night. By 11:15 p.m., the Charlotte streets were slick and black rain hammering the pavement in sheets, traffic signals swinging on their cables above empty intersections. Most of the city had already gone home, pulled off their shoes, and forgotten about the world outside their front doors. Daniel Mercer hadn't gone home yet. He was still inside. Asteron Medical Systems' 8-story headquarters on the south side of Charlotte, kneeling on a concrete floor in the basement mechanical room, his hands inside an environmental control panel that had decided at the absolute worst possible time to stop cooperating. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist, leaving a dark smear of grease across his skin, and checked his watch for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. 11:19 p.m. He had promised Sophie he'd be home by 9. Sophie was 9 years old. She was already asleep, he knew that. Mrs. Garland from next door was sitting on their couch watching television and charging him $20 an hour, which was more than fair, but still the numbers were adding up, the way numbers always added up at the end of the month, quietly and ruthlessly, like water filling a room. Daniel took a slow breath and turned back to the panel. The system had to be reset before morning. Asteron had an FDA inspection scheduled at 8 a.m., a critical one tied to a product certification that the company had been building toward for 2 years. If the laboratory environmental controls failed during that inspection, the consequences would cascade through every department in the building, and Daniel, as senior facilities coordinator, would be the man standing in the middle of it. He wasn't the most important person at Asteron Medical Systems. He wasn't even close. His name didn't appear in any press releases. He didn't attend the executive meetings on the 7th floor. He ate lunch in the break room on the 2nd floor, not the private dining room reserved for senior leadership. When Claire Whitmore walked through the lobby each morning, and she always arrived by 6:45, never later, always in a dark blazer, always moving like someone who had already made 4 decisions before most people had finished their coffee. She walked right past Daniel without ever once slowing down. I didn't take it personally. That was simply how the world worked. He kept the building running. She ran the company. They operated in completely different atmospheres, separated by 7 floors, and approximately $60 million in annual compensation. Daniel finally found the fault. A relay switch that had corroded from a slow water leak no one had reported, and replaced it with a backup unit from the supply closet. The system hummed back to life. The pressure gauges steadied. He watched the readings stabilize, waited 2 full minutes to be certain, then closed the panel and gathered his tools. He should have gone straight to the parking garage. He almost did. But part of his job, the part that had kept him employed for 6 years without a single serious complaint, was thoroughness. He had reset the basement system. But the executive floor on 7 had a separate environmental branch that shared the same circuit pathway. A reset at the basement level sometimes created a feedback delay in the upper nodes. It would take him 3 minutes to check. He took the service elevator to the 7th floor. The executive level was quiet in a different way than the rest of the building. Downstairs emptiness felt ordinary. Up here it felt like something held its breath. The carpet was thicker, the lighting warmer. The whole floor smelled faintly of fresh flowers, which was apparently part of some interior design philosophy Daniel had never been asked about. He checked the environmental panel in the utility closet near the stairwell. Readings were fine. He updated the log on his tablet, initialed the entry, and turned to go. That's when he heard the sound. It was sharp, clean, glass hitting a hard floor. Daniel stopped walking. He stood completely still in the hallway for a moment, listening. The building should have been empty up here. Security had done their 10 p.m. sweep. He had passed the guard desk downstairs, Marcus reading a paperback thriller, who'd waved him through without looking up. Another sound. Softer. Something shifting against furniture. Daniel moved toward it. The private conference room at the far end of the hall. Claire Whitmore's personal conference room. The one nobody was ever invited into unless she wanted them. There had its door not fully closed. A narrow band of light fell across the hallway carpet. Daniel knocked twice. No answer. He pushed the door open. He saw the broken water glass first. It had fallen from the small credenza along the side wall and shattered across the hardwood floor near the windows, water still spreading in a thin sheet across the dark wood. Then he saw her. Claire Whitmore was on the floor beside the conference table, one hand braced against the leg of a chair, the other arm limp at her side. Her blazer was pushed up on one shoulder. A cut on her forearm from the broken glass had stained part of her sleeve a dark wet red. But Daniel's eyes didn't stay on the cut. He had seen enough medical emergencies, years of them sitting beside a hospital bed, learning what a body looks like when it is trying to signal that something is very wrong, to know that the cut wasn't the problem. The problem was her face. One side of it wasn't moving right. Her left eye was slightly different from the right. Her speech when she tried to speak came out slow and clumsy, like words being pulled through resistance. "I'm fine." Her voice was flat, controlled, even now. "I don't need—" "Don't move," Daniel said. He was already across the room, crouching beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "Look at me. Can you look at me?" She did. Her eyes focused on him. Dark brown, sharp, and for the first time in the 6 years he had worked in this building, uncertain. "What's your name?" he asked. She gave him a look that would have withered a less steady man. "I know my own name." "Tell me anyway." A short pause. "Claire Whitmore." The second word came a half-second slower than it should have. Daniel's jaw tightened. He reached for his phone. "No." Her good hand caught his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Don't call the company line. Don't call corporate security. I'm calling 911. Not on the company phone. Don't tell them where you're calling from." He looked at her. "Claire, listen to me." Her voice was low and focused, pulling itself together by force of will. "There is a board vote tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. If the wrong people find out I'm incapacitated tonight, they can invoke Section 14C of our governance structure. I lose the CEO seat before I can defend it. I don't care about the board vote." "I do. You might be having a stroke." She said nothing for a moment. Then, "I know." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Daniel dialed 911 on his personal cell phone. The dispatcher was calm, professional, and delivered the worst possible news in the most efficient way. A multi-vehicle accident 2 miles away from a water main break had stretched emergency resources across the south side of Charlotte. Available ambulances were tied up. Estimated response time 22 to 30 minutes, possibly longer with the storm. "If you're able to safely transport the patient," the dispatcher said, "Mercy, regional emergency, is 8 minutes away. That would be the faster option." Daniel looked at Claire Whitmore. Brilliant, feared, impossibly private, barely conscious on the floor of her own conference room, and made the kind of decision that happens in seconds but changes everything that follows. "Stay with me," he said. "I'm going to get you up." "I can walk. You have one working arm and your balance is off. You're not walking anywhere by yourself." She started to argue. He didn't let her finish. He got one arm under her shoulders and the other beneath her knees and lifted her. She was lighter than he expected, which told him she hadn't been eating enough, which was the kind of observation he immediately told himself was irrelevant. "This is completely unnecessary," she said. "Uh-huh. I could have you fired for this. You can fire me from the hospital." He carried her through the conference room door down the hallway to the service elevator, because the service elevator was faster and closer, and Daniel Mercer always knew the fastest route through any building he maintained. He kept his footsteps steady. She said nothing for a moment, which concerned him more than her arguing had. "Talk to me," he said. "About what?" "Anything. What were you working on tonight?" "Board preparation." "Tell me about it." "You wouldn't understand it." "Try me." A pause. "We're preparing a response to a proposed acquisition of our diagnostic division by a company called Helixor Global. I've been opposed to it. Some board members disagree." "Why are you opposed?" "Because the valuation is wrong. The numbers were manipulated to make the division look worth less than it is. Someone inside this company has been feeding false data to the acquisition committee, and I've been trying to prove it for 4 months. The elevator doors opened. Daniel walked out into the lobby. "Have you proved it?" Something shifted in her expression. "Tonight I finally had what I needed." He pushed through the lobby's side door into the rain. His SUV was parked 30 feet away in the employee lot. A 2015 Ford Explorer with a cracked dashboard mount, a back seat permanently scattered with Sophie's school things, and 147,000 miles on the odometer. He got Claire into the passenger seat, buckled her in, and was behind the wheel and moving in under 90 seconds. "You're a facilities coordinator," she said. Her speech was still slow but present. "How do you know what a neurological emergency looks like?" Daniel pulled out of the lot and turned toward Mercy Regional. The rain was heavy now, the windshield wipers working hard. "My wife," he said. "She was sick for a long time before she died. I learned to read the signs." Claire was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know you had a wife." "She passed 4 years ago." "I'm sorry." He glanced at her. "Keep talking. Don't close your eyes." "I'm not closing my eyes." "Good. What's your daughter's name?" He looked at her again. She'd remembered. From the elevator, from his brief mention upstairs. "Sophie," he said. "She's 9. "What's she like?" Daniel almost smiled despite everything. "She's the kind of kid who asks questions I don't have answers to. Last week she asked me why clouds don't fall down. I looked it up for 20 minutes. Do you know the answer? Something about air pressure and water density. She said my explanation was kind of boring and looked it up herself. A sound came out of Claire that might in a different context have been a laugh. "Stay with me," Daniel said. His voice was quiet but firm. "Sophie wants to meet you someday. Don't make me tell her it didn't happen." Claire turned her head slowly toward him. "You're a strange man, Daniel Mercer." "I've been told." Mercy Regional's emergency bay was lit hard against the storm. Daniel pulled in fast, got out of the SUV, and had Claire's door open before the orderly on the curb had finished reaching for his radio. He said the words, "possible, TIA, or cerebral aneurysm, left side weakness speech, irregularity onset," approximately 40 minutes ago clearly and quickly, because 6 years of coordinating medical building systems had required him to learn the language, and he had learned it completely. They moved Claire onto a gurney with practiced speed. She didn't let go of Daniel's hand until they made her. He stood in the waiting area still in his grimy work uniform, rain-soaked with grease on his wrist and someone else's blood on his sleeve, and he did not entirely know what to do with himself. A nurse approached him 20 minutes later. "Sir, are you with Ms. Whitmore?" "I'm the one who brought her in. She's asking for you. She's conscious, but we need to move quickly. The neurology team has identified a cerebral aneurysm. It's been leaking. She needs surgery within the hour." Daniel followed the nurse through swinging doors. The trauma bay was bright and busy, and organized in the way that emergency rooms are organized, controlled. Urgency voices measured movement, deliberate. They had Claire on a bed with monitors attached and an IV already running. She looked smaller here than she did in the building. He had never thought of Claire Whitmore as small. In the 7 years she had led Asteron from a $2 million startup to a $600 million medical technology company, she had never looked small. She had looked like someone who made rooms rearrange themselves around her presence. Here, under fluorescent lights in a hospital gown with her hair loose and her face without any of the armor she wore so precisely, she looked like what she was. A person. A frightened one. "They told me," she said when he came to stand beside the bed. "I figured." Brain surgery. She said it the same way someone might say unexpected thunderstorm, acknowledging a reality they hadn't planned for. "You're going to be fine." "You don't know that." "No," he agreed. "But I think you're too stubborn to let a blood vessel in your head win." A ghost of something crossed her face. "You're still talking to me the same way." "What way?" "Like I'm a person." Daniel looked at her. "You are a person." She didn't answer that directly. Instead, the nurse approached with the surgical authorization paperwork, a clipboard thick with forms with flags on the sections that needed signatures. Claire signed methodically, her good hand moving steadily through each page. She had clearly dealt with paperwork in high-pressure situations before. It showed. She reached the last page. Near the bottom, inside a bordered box with bold type above it, was the line, "Emergency Contact. Authorized representative print name and sign below." Daniel watched her pause. He watched her look at the line for several seconds. He thought she was searching her memory for an attorney's name. He knew Asteron had a full legal team. He knew there were people whose entire job was to handle exactly this kind of situation on Claire Whitmore's behalf. Then she picked up the pen, and she wrote 2 words. Daniel Mercer. He stared at the form. "Claire." He didn't know what else to say at first. "You barely know me." She set the pen down and looked up at him. Her eyes were clear and steady. Whatever confusion had blurred her speech earlier, now burned away by focus and exhaustion and something he couldn't quite name. "I know what you did tonight when nobody was watching," she said. "I did what anyone would have done." "No." She said it simply, without drama. "You didn't do what anyone would have done. I have security cameras in that building, Daniel. I know exactly what is visible from every angle. I know every camera position on the executive floor." Her good hand rested flat on the bed beside her. "I know what you could have done when you found me. You could have called the company line. You could have photographed me and sold it to a media contact. You could have used what I told you in the elevator as leverage." She paused. "You did none of those things." "Of course I didn't." "That's exactly my point." She held his eyes. "Most people given that situation, given power over someone like me, would have used it. Consciously or not. A word here. A implication there. Some quiet leverage for a future moment." Her voice was steady. "You chose my life before you knew whether helping me would benefit you at all." Daniel didn't have an answer for that. She tapped the form with one finger. "That name stays on there." Then the surgical team came in, and the room became controlled, organized motion, and they wheeled her toward the OR doors, and Daniel stood in the trauma bay, holding a clipboard that gave an ordinary facilities employee unexpected legal authority over one of the most powerful executives in the state of North Carolina. He stood there for a long moment. Then he sat down in the chair beside the empty bed, and he waited. He had been waiting for less than an hour when the suits started arriving. The first one came in at 1:30 a.m., a man in his mid-50s, silver-haired with the kind of natural authority that didn't need to announce itself, wearing a cashmere coat over his dress shirt, like he'd gotten dressed in 90 seconds and still managed to look better than most men did on their best day. Graham Voss. Daniel didn't know his face, but he'd heard the name. Everyone at Asteron had. Executive chairman. One of the original investors. The man who, depending on who you asked, was either Claire's most important ally or her most complicated problem. Graham walked into the ER waiting area with 2 other men younger, carrying leather portfolios, and immediately began speaking to the charge nurse in the kind of voice that assumed it would be listened to. Daniel watched from his chair across the room. Within 3 minutes, Graham had been told that Claire was in surgery, that no information could be released, and that he would need to speak to the attending physician in the morning. He didn't like those answers. He turned from the nurse desk and swept the waiting room with his eyes. They landed on Daniel, on the dirty work uniform, the rain-soaked jacket, the grease and the dried blood on his sleeve. Graham walked toward him. "You were with her." Daniel stood, not because he was intimidated, because his father had taught him to stand when someone approached you. "I brought her in." Graham studied him the way certain men study things they're deciding whether to pick up or leave on the floor. "Your facilities staff. Senior Facilities Coordinator. You transported the CEO of this company in a..." He paused. "What vehicle?" "My SUV." Graham absorbed that. Then, "Who knows she's here? I called 911 on my personal phone. I don't know who else might know. The board vote is in 6 hours. Daniel said nothing. "I need to know her condition," Graham said. "I need to speak with her doctors. I need to understand what we're dealing with from a governance perspective. Who has her authorization paperwork?" Daniel kept his voice even. "She's in surgery. I understand that. But I need access to her information as a matter of corporate necessity. She would want the executive team informed. I'm the executive chairman. I need to know what decisions have been made here. Consent, authorization, representation." Daniel looked at him for a moment. "Her authorization is handled," Daniel said. Graham paused. "By whom?" Daniel held the man's gaze. "By the person she put on the form." The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. Graham Voss looked at Daniel Mercer, the work uniform, the grease, the blood, the quiet steadiness in his eyes, and something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, not with visible anger, just a recalibration, a recognition. "And who," Graham said carefully, "are you?" "Daniel Mercer." He didn't offer his hand. "Asteron Medical Systems, Senior Facilities Coordinator, 6 years with the company." Graham was quiet for a moment, then he smiled. It was the kind of smile that had nothing warm in it. "Well, Daniel." Graham's voice dropped to something almost conversational. "It sounds like you've had quite a night." "Yes, sir," Daniel said. "I have." Graham held his eyes a moment longer. Then he turned, walked back to the 2 men with the leather portfolios, and began speaking to them in a low voice. Daniel sat back down. He looked at his hands. He thought about Sophie asleep at home in her bed. "I thought about Claire Whitmore, somewhere in this building right now, with a neurosurgical team working on the inside of her skull." He thought about what she had said. "You chose my life before you knew whether helping me would benefit you." He picked up his phone and typed a message to Mrs. Garland next door. "Running late. Emergency at work. Please stay tonight. I'll cover extra." Sophie shouldn't worry. Then he set the phone down. And he stayed. That was the whole of it. He stayed. Because it was the only thing that made any sense to do. The surgeon came out at 4:17 a.m. She was a compact woman with short gray hair and the kind of unhurried manner that Daniel had learned to associate with people who had seen everything and decided that rushing solved nothing. She crossed the waiting room toward Daniel, not toward Graham Voss, who had positioned himself deliberately near the doors, not toward the 3 additional Asteron attorneys who had appeared around 3 a.m., not toward the 2 board members who had shown up at 3:45 and were now drinking coffee and speaking in low voices near the window. She came to Daniel, because his name was on the form. The aneurysm was a grade 2 rupture, the surgeon said. She spoke clearly and without decoration, and Daniel appreciated that. "We've clipped it successfully. The surgery went well. She'll be in recovery for several hours. The next 48 hours will be important in terms of monitoring for vasospasm and assessing any lasting neurological effects. But the immediate danger is past." Daniel let out a long breath. "Can I see her?" "Not yet. Tomorrow morning, most likely." "Okay." He nodded slowly. "Thank you." The surgeon glanced once at the cluster of suits across the waiting room, then back at Daniel. "You did the right thing getting her here when you did," she said quietly. "Another 30 minutes, and we'd be having a very different conversation." She walked away. Daniel sat alone for a long moment. Then Graham Voss was beside him. Not aggressive, not loud. quiet and precise the way real danger usually is. I think, Graham said, sitting down one chair away, that you and I should have a conversation. Daniel looked at him. She's going to be fine, Daniel said. That's the good news. Yes. Graham's voice was pleasant. And the board vote is in 2.5 hours. Outside the hospital windows, Daniel could see the first gray edge of dawn beginning to separate the sky from the horizon. The storm had passed. Charlotte was waking up, and Daniel Mercer, who had gone to work last night to fix a broken relay switch so his daughter could afford braces, was sitting in a hospital waiting room with a billionaire's signature in his name and powerful men closing in from every direction. He was still in his dirty work uniform. He had $43 in his checking account. He had made no calculations about what any of this might mean for his future. He had simply stayed, and somehow that was exactly the thing that made everything that was coming next inevitable. Graham Voss sat down one chair away from Daniel, and the distance between them felt like the distance between two completely different worlds. He didn't look at Daniel right away. He crossed one leg over the other, adjusted the cuff of his coat, and looked out the window at the gray dawn breaking over Charlotte. He had the particular patience of a man who had learned long ago that silence was a more effective weapon than volume. 6 years, Graham said finally. Daniel looked at him. Sir, you've been with Asteron 6 years. He said it the way someone reads a file. Flat, informational. Senior Facilities Coordinator. Before that, 3 years at Meridian Property Group. Before that, 2 years at a smaller outfit in Concord. He paused. You know your building systems. Everyone says so. Marcus at the security desk said you could find a faulty relay in a 300,000 square foot building in the dark. Marcus is generous. It's not generosity, it's a fact. Graham finally turned and looked at him. His eyes were a pale, steady gray, the kind that didn't show what was behind them. You're a capable man, Daniel, that's obvious, which is exactly why I think you understand the position you're in right now. Daniel waited. Claire is going to survive, Graham continued. That's good. I mean that sincerely. She's a remarkable woman, and nobody in that boardroom wanted anything to happen to her. He paused just long enough to let that land. But survival and capacity are two different things. She just had emergency brain surgery. The next 48 hours are uncertain. And in 2 hours and 17 minutes, the Asteron board is scheduled to vote on the most significant corporate transaction in this company's history, the Helixor acquisition. Graham tilted his head slightly. She told you about that? In the car, on the way here. Something moved behind Graham's pale eyes. What exactly did she tell you? Daniel held his gaze. She told me the valuation was wrong, that someone inside the company manipulated the numbers. The silence that followed was exactly 1 second longer than comfortable. Then Graham smiled. Not the warm kind. The kind that people like Graham Voss use as a tool, the way a carpenter uses a level. Claire has been under enormous stress for months. The kind of stress that can distort a person's perspective. Make them see patterns that aren't necessarily there. He tilted his head slightly. I want you to understand something, Daniel. Whatever Claire said in that car, she was in the early stages of a medical emergency. Her judgment was compromised. Whatever she told you, whatever she believes she found, it should be treated with compassion, not as reliable intelligence. She seemed pretty clear to me. She had a brain aneurysm. Not when she was talking. The symptoms came later. Another pause. Longer this time. Graham unfolded his leg, leaned forward slightly, and rested his elbows on his knees. His voice dropped to something almost intimate, almost kind. I'm going to be honest with you because I think you're the kind of man who respects honesty. What happens in the next few hours matters enormously, not just for this company, but for 4,000 employees who depend on Asteron's stability, for their families, their mortgages, their kids' futures. He let that settle. The board needs to be able to proceed today. The governance structure allows for a temporary leadership provision if the CEO is medically incapacitated. All that requires is documentation from someone with medical authorization. Someone like the name on that form. Daniel was quiet. I am not asking you to harm Claire, Graham said. I'm asking you to acknowledge a medical reality that a neurosurgeon could confirm in 30 seconds. She just had brain surgery. She cannot participate in a corporate vote today. That's simply true. And if I sign something to that effect, Daniel said slowly, what happens to the vote? It proceeds under emergency provisions. The board makes the decision on the Helixer acquisition. Business continues. And Claire recovers, returns. Everything continues normally. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, except the vote she was trying to stop goes through without her. The temperature in the conversation dropped several degrees. Graham straightened. The vote was going to happen with or without her. The board has the right. She told me the numbers were manipulated. Daniel kept his voice even. She told me someone inside the company fed false data to the acquisition committee to make the diagnostic division look worth less than it is. She said she had proof. He paused. You want me to sign a document that lets a vote go through that she believes is built on fraud, tonight, before anyone looks at what she found? Graham studied him. Then something shifted in his expression. The warmth, already thin, drained away completely. What was left underneath was not angry. It was simply cold and precise, and entirely without sympathy. Let me be very clear, Graham said quietly. I have been running companies since you were in high school. I have navigated situations that would end careers, destroy reputations, and leave competent men with nothing. I have this, not because I am cruel, but because business operates by rules that don't care about intentions. He paused. You are a facilities coordinator. You are a single father with a daughter in elementary school. You have a mortgage on a house in East Charlotte, a vehicle that probably shouldn't pass its next inspection, and a bank balance that I suspect would not survive one missed paycheck. Daniel's jaw tightened. I am not threatening you, Graham said. I am describing reality. The reality is that what you do in the next 2 hours will determine the shape of your next 10 years. I can make sure that your loyalty tonight is rewarded in ways that would genuinely change your daughter's life. Or, he stopped. Let the silence do the work. I can make sure that your interference in a legitimate corporate governance process costs you everything you've spent 6 years building. Daniel sat with that for a moment. Then he said, You mentioned Sophie. I mentioned your daughter, yes. You mentioned her school. I have a thorough staff. Yeah. Daniel nodded slowly. I noticed. He looked down at his hands. Can I ask you something? Of course. When you walked into this hospital tonight, first thing you did before you even asked the nurse how Claire was, you asked about the vote. I was watching from across the room. Daniel looked up. Is that true, or am I wrong? Graham said nothing. You asked about the vote before you asked if she was alive, Daniel said. I was 30 feet away, and I watched it happen. He paused. I just wanted to make sure I was reading that right before I decided anything. Something flickered in Graham's eyes. I'm going to go get some coffee, Daniel said and stood up. He walked to the vending machine at the end of the hall, put in $1.50, and stood there while the machine ground through its cycle, and he thought about Sophie. He thought about the braces appointment next month. He thought about the inspection sticker on the SUV that was already 3 months overdue. He thought about Mrs. Garland on his couch and the $20 an hour he owed her, and the fact that he still hadn't eaten anything since the granola bar he'd had at 7 o'clock the previous evening. I thought about $500,000. Because that was the number Graham named 40 minutes later when he found Daniel in the family waiting room just off the main corridor, away from the board members and attorneys clustered near the entrance. $500,000. I didn't announce it. He placed a folded piece of paper on the chair next to Daniel, sat down across from him, and said it the same way a man might quote a contractor price. Matter of fact. Reasonable. Like it was just a number being offered for services rendered. Sophie's education, Graham said. Fully covered. A trust account established today. College, graduate school, wherever she wants to go. Plus, a personal payment of $500,000, transferred to an account of your choosing within 72 hours of today's vote. He clasped his hands loosely in his lap. And a promotion. Director level. Real salary. Real benefits. The kind of position you've earned but probably stopped believing you'd ever see. Daniel stared at the folded paper. He did not pick it up. "All I need," Graham said, "is your signature on a document that states Claire Whitmore is currently medically unable to participate in corporate decisions," which she is. "The surgeon already said the next 48 hours are uncertain. You're not lying. You're stating a documented medical fact." The family waiting room was small and quiet. There was a box of tissues on a side table, a framed landscape print on the wall, the kind of room designed to absorb grief without comment. Daniel thought about what Claire had said in the elevator on the way down. Not the corporate information, not the acquisition. The other thing, the quiet, exhausted way she had said, "Tonight I finally had what I needed." The way she'd said it, like someone who had been carrying a weight for a very long time and had finally just barely reached the place they'd been trying to reach. And then someone had entered her office while he was driving her here. I didn't know that part yet. That would come later. But he was already thinking about it in the way that experienced facilities coordinators think, who went where, when, and why, and whether the record of it matched what he knew should be true. "You need an answer now," Daniel asked. "The vote is in 90 minutes. Daniel looked at the folded paper. He thought about Sophie's face when she was excited, the way she talked with her whole body. Hands moving sentences, running into each other. He thought about her asking him last week why he looked tired, and him telling her he was fine, and her saying, "Dad, I know what fine looks like," and that's not it. 9 years old. She already knew. Daniel picked up the folded paper. Graham watched him. Daniel unfolded it, read it carefully, all of it, every line the way his father had taught him to read anything before he touched a pen, and then refolded it along its original crease and set it back on the chair beside him. "No," he said. Graham was very still. "I'm not signing that." "Daniel, she told me the numbers were manipulated. She told me she had proof. Someone went into her office while she was unconscious in my car." He looked directly at Graham. "I don't know yet who it was, but I know it happened, and I know that what you're asking me to do right now clears the way for a vote that she was about to stop." His voice was steady, not raised, not emotional, just steady. "I'm not signing it." The quiet in the room changed texture. When Graham spoke again, the pleasant reasonableness was entirely gone. "You need to think about what you're doing very carefully." "I have." "You are a facilities coordinator. You have no standing in this process. You have no understanding of the legal exposure you're creating for yourself by interfering with—" "I'm not interfering with anything. I'm just not signing something." Daniel stood up. "And I'm going to stay here until Claire can speak for herself. That's all I'm doing." Graham stood too. And for a moment, they were just two men standing in a small waiting room, and the distance between them was about 3 feet of carpet, and it should not have felt like the kind of standoff it felt like. "You have a daughter," Graham said. His voice was quiet and flat and precise. "I want you to think about her future. Not just college, not just now. I want you to think about what it looks like for a 9-year-old girl when her father makes an enemy of the wrong people. When his career evaporates. When every reference call goes cold. When every door in a 30-mile radius closes because the people who close doors decided to." He held Daniel's eyes. "I am not threatening Sophie. I want to be absolutely clear about that. I am simply describing what the world looks like for a man who makes powerful enemies for no reason." Daniel looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something that Graham Voss, in 40 years of corporate life, had probably never heard from a man in a dirty work uniform in a hospital waiting room. "My daughter is 9 years old," Daniel said quietly. "And every day I try to teach her one thing. That character is what you do when doing the right thing costs you something." He paused. "She's watching me even when I'm not home. Even when she's asleep. She's watching me. And I can't sign that document and then go home and look at her." He took a breath. "So whatever it costs me, you do what you're going to do. But I'm not signing it." He walked out of the room. Behind him, Graham Voss stood alone in the small, quiet space and did not move for a very long time. It was 6:03 in the morning. Natalie Brooks arrived at the hospital at 6:20. Daniel knew her by sight. Asteron's general counsel, a tall woman with a precise measured way of moving through a room that suggested she was always calculating 3 variables simultaneously. She had sharp eyes and the particular composure of someone who had spent 20 years in rooms where the wrong sentence cost millions. She found Daniel in the corridor outside the recovery wing, standing with a cup of bad vending machine coffee going cold in his hand. She looked at him the way people look at something they're trying to categorize. "Mr. Mercer." "Mrs. Brooks. I heard about last night, what you did." She stopped in front of him. "How is she?" "Surgery went well. They're monitoring her." Natalie nodded. She looked down at her own hands for a moment, then back up. "Graham spoke to me 20 minutes ago." Her voice was neutral, careful. "He told me you declined to sign." "That's right." She was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why, honestly, setting aside everything else, the money, the principle, all of it, why you could walk away from this right now? Nobody would think less of you. You saved her life. That's real. That's enough. Nobody expects anything more from a facilities coordinator." Daniel looked at her. "Do you believe the acquisition numbers are accurate?" Natalie's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. A small, careful shift like a door opening an inch. "That's a complicated question," she said. "Is it?" She looked down the corridor. The board members and attorneys were visible at the far end near the elevator bank, their voices low, their body language tense. Graham was among them. He had not looked in Daniel's direction since leaving the waiting room. "Claire told you she had found something," Natalie said. It was not a question. "She did." "Did she tell you where it was?" "No." Daniel studied her face. "Why?" Natalie was quiet for another moment. Then very carefully she said, "Her office was accessed at approximately 12:40 a.m., executive override. The credential log would show a name." She paused. "But credential logs can be adjusted by someone who knows the right system. I've been trying to pull the original record for the past hour, and I'm getting access errors I've never seen before." Daniel's mind went very still. He thought about the environmental control system in the basement, the one he'd reset the night before, the one that shared a circuit pathway with the executive floor. He thought about the mechanical control server, an independent unit older than the main digital system installed during the original building construction and largely ignored during the last 2 network upgrades because nobody thought it mattered. It logged everything independently, not the credential system, not the security cameras. The mechanical relay system. Every electronic door trigger in the building recorded against the HVAC sequencing log, because the original contractor had wired them onto the same timing circuit. It wasn't supposed to be a security record, but it was. And Daniel was possibly the only person in the building who knew it existed. He looked at Natalie Brooks. "Are you on Claire's side?" he asked directly. She met his eyes. "I have been Claire's counsel for 9 years." That's not an answer. A pause. Yes, she said. "I'm on her side." "Then I need to get into the building." Natalie stared at him. "The vote is in 50 minutes. I know." He set the cold coffee down on the windowsill beside him. "But if what I think is in that mechanical server is actually there, the vote doesn't matter. The whole thing unravels." He looked at her steadily. "Can you get me building access without going through the executive credential system?" "I have a general counsel override. It's physical key-based. It doesn't log digitally." "Then let's go." She looked at him for a long moment. This man in a dirty work uniform, who had carried her CEO through a lobby at midnight, and sat in a hospital waiting room until 4 in the morning, and turned down $500,000 because of something he was trying to teach his 9-year-old daughter. "You know what you're doing?" she asked. "I know that building," Daniel said. "Better than anyone." He paused. "I don't know everything else, but I know that part." Natalie reached into her bag. She pulled out a slim, old-fashioned physical keycard, the kind from the building's original access system before the digital overlay went in, before the network upgrades, before everything got faster and smarter and easier to manipulate. She held it out. Daniel took it. Outside the hospital windows, Charlotte's morning was fully bright. Now the storm entirely gone, the streets washed clean and glittering in the early light. In 47 minutes, the Asteron board would sit down to vote. And Daniel Mercer, who had come to work the night before to fix a corroded relay switch, walked back through the hospital's automatic doors, got into his battered SUV with the cracked dashboard and the spelling homework still on the back seat floor, and drove toward the building he had maintained for 6 years. Toward a mechanical server that no one thought mattered. Toward a truth that someone had tried very hard to bury. He drove without rushing, because the thing about buildings, the thing Daniel had learned in 20 years of keeping them running was that they remembered everything. Every door that opened, every system that triggered, every moment someone thought they were alone. Buildings remembered, and Daniel knew exactly where to look. Daniel pulled into the Asteron parking garage at 6:41 in the morning. The building looked exactly the same as it always did. Same concrete, same glass, same security camera above the employee entrance blinking its slow red pulse. But something felt different about it now, the way a familiar street feels different after something terrible has happened on it. Like the building itself knew what had occurred inside it the night before, and was holding its breath. Marcus was not at the security desk. The overnight shift had ended. A younger guard Daniel barely recognized looked up from behind the console, saw the Asteron badge on his jacket, and buzzed him through without a word. Daniel kept walking. He kept his pace normal, unhurried. He had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to draw attention in a building was to look like you were trying not to draw attention. He took the service elevator to the basement. The mechanical room was exactly as he had left it the night before. Panel-closed tools back in the supply closet. The replaced relay sitting in the discard bin where he'd tossed it at 11:30 p.m., which now felt like it had happened in a different lifetime. The environmental system was running clean. He checked the gauges out of habit the way he always did, because 6 years of maintaining a building teaches your hands to verify things before your brain finishes asking the question. Then he crossed the mechanical room to the far wall, behind the main HVAC control rack, behind a steel utility shelf, holding spare filter housings and a box of cable ties that had been sitting there since the previous facilities manager retired, was a panel that most people who worked in this building did not know existed. It was labeled Integrated Relay Control Building Original, and it had a small digital display about the size of a paperback novel, and it had not been meaningfully checked by anyone in at least 4 years. Daniel pulled the shelf aside, punched in the 6-digit maintenance code that he had memorized during his first month on the job and never forgotten, and the display lit up. The unit was fully operational. He had explained to Natalie in the car, talking fast, while she drove her own vehicle back toward the building 3 minutes behind him, that the original construction contractor had wired the building's electronic door triggers onto the same timing circuit as the HVAC sequencing system. It was a cost-saving measure from 2009 that nobody had bothered to correct during 2 subsequent network upgrades, because the system was invisible independent, and as far as the executive team was concerned, entirely irrelevant. It logged relay triggers, not credentials, not camera footage, just door events, open, closed, locked, unlocked, matched against the building's mechanical timing sequence, down to the second. It could not be accessed remotely. It could not be edited through the main network. It had no connection to the digital credential system that Graham's people had apparently managed to manipulate. It was just a dumb old standalone relay log that nobody thought was worth manipulating because nobody knew it existed. Daniel pulled up the event log for the previous night. He set the filter to executive floor door events and ran it back to 10:00 p.m. The display populated line by line. 10:47 p.m. Executive floor, main corridor door. Trigger event. Open. That was Daniel himself going up to check the environmental node. 11:03 p.m. Executive floor, main corridor door. Trigger event. Open. This was him leaving. Then nothing until 12:38 a.m. 12:38 a.m. Executive floor, main corridor door. Trigger event. Open. 12:39 a.m. Private conference room, east wing. Trigger event. Open. 12:41 a.m. Private conference room, east wing. Trigger event. Closed, locked. 12:44 a.m. executive floor, main corridor door. Trigger event. Open exit sequence. Daniel stared at the display. Someone had entered the executive floor at 12:38 a.m., 51 minutes after Daniel had carried Claire out of the building. Someone had gone directly to her private conference room, spent 2 minutes inside it, and left. In and out in 6 minutes total. Professional. Purposeful. Exactly the kind of access pattern that someone makes when they know exactly what they're looking for and exactly where it is. Daniel pulled out his phone and photographed every line on the display. Then he photographed the unit itself, its serial number, its installation plate, its independent power source. He photographed the maintenance code panel. He photographed the relay circuit diagram mounted on the inside of the access door. Then he pulled up the digital credential log on his tablet, the same one Natalie had told him was showing access errors she'd never seen before, and compared the timestamps. The digital log showed no executive floor activity between 10:00 p.m. and 6:00 a.m. Nothing. As if no one had been there at all. Someone had deleted it. Someone had gone into Claire's conference room at 12:38 in the morning, taken whatever she had gathered, the evidence she had described in the elevator as she was losing consciousness. The thing she'd said she'd finally obtained that night, and then wiped the digital record of ever being there. But they hadn't known about the relay log. Because nobody knew about the relay log. Daniel saved every photograph to his personal cloud backup, then texted the full series to Natalie Brooks with 3 words. Found it. Come now. He looked at his watch. 6:53 a.m. The board vote was in 7 minutes. He took the service elevator back up. Natalie was already in the lobby when the elevator doors opened, her phone in her hand, reading his photographs with an expression that moved through several stages quickly. Focus recognition, and then something that looked a great deal like controlled fury. The digital log was wiped, Daniel said. I know. She didn't look up from her phone. I've been staring at access errors for the past hour that I now understand weren't errors. Someone ran a selective purge on the credential timestamps for the executive floor. She looked up. But this, she held up her phone, his photographs on the screen. This doesn't go through the credential system at all. Independent relay circuit, completely isolated. Can it be challenged? Can someone argue it's unreliable? It's the original building system. It's been logging continuously since 2009. Every maintenance inspection for 14 years. It's never been altered because nobody ever thought to alter it. Daniel held her eyes. It's cleaner than the digital system because it's too boring for anyone to bother with. Natalie was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, We need to get upstairs. The 7th floor boardroom was the kind of room that announced its own importance without trying. Long table, high-backed chairs, a wall of windows. 7 board members were already seated when Daniel and Natalie came through the door, and the particular silence that fell when they entered was the kind of silence that meant their arrival had been the last thing anyone expected. Graham Voss was at the head of the table. He looked at Daniel with an expression that lasted less than a second, before it was replaced by something smooth and controlled. But Daniel had spent 6 years reading building systems, which meant he had spent 6 years reading subtle signals, and that 1 second was enough. Graham had not expected this. Natalie, he said, his voice perfectly even. The meeting is in session. This is a closed board. I'm general counsel, Natalie said, and she pulled out the chair to the left of the head position and sat down as if she had been planning to sit there all morning. I have standing in every board session, you know that. And Mr. Mercer is here at my request. She set her phone on the table face down and folded her hands. I need 5 minutes before the vote opens. There is a procedural matter. A board member to Graham's right. A woman in her 60s named Harriet Caldwell, who Daniel had seen maybe twice in the halls of Asteron, and who had a reputation for being the sharpest person in any room she entered, said, What procedural matter? The integrity of the acquisition timeline, Natalie said. Specifically whether the data underlying the valuation of the diagnostic division was accurately represented to this board. The air in the room changed. Graham set both hands flat on the table. It was a controlled gesture. Deliberate. The gesture of a man who was running calculations behind very still eyes. The valuation has been independently verified by 3 separate financial advisory firms. Natalie, you reviewed those reports yourself. I reviewed the reports I was given, she said. The question is whether those reports accurately reflected the internal data they were supposed to be based on. This is a delay tactic. Graham looked around the table. Claire's illness has understandably affected the judgment of some of her associates. Claire found something. Daniel said it from where he was standing near the door. He hadn't planned to speak yet. But Graham's voice when he said the word illness, the particular way he wrapped it around Claire's name, like a constraint, like a diminishment, made the words come out of Daniel before he'd finished deciding to say them. Every head in the room turned toward him. He was still in his work uniform. I was aware of how he looked in this room. He was aware of the difference between his worn jacket and the suits around that table. He let himself be aware of it and then set it aside, the same way he set aside irrelevant variables when he was diagnosing a building problem. Last night, he said, Claire Whitmore spent approximately 30 minutes before her medical emergency going through documents in her private conference room. She told me in the car on the way to Mercy Regional that she had finally obtained evidence of data manipulation in the acquisition timeline. She described it as the thing she'd been building toward for 4 months. He paused. At 12:38 this morning, while she was in surgery, someone entered her conference room. They were inside for 2 minutes. They left. The entire digital credential record of that entry was subsequently deleted. Graham's voice was perfectly controlled. That's a remarkable claim for a facilities coordinator to be making in a board meeting. I have the relay log, Daniel said. Silence. He held up his phone. The photographs were already open. The building's original mechanical relay system logs every door event on an independent circuit. It has no connection to the digital credential network. It cannot be accessed remotely and has never been included in any network update. It logged an executive floor entry at 12:38 a.m., access to Claire's conference room at 12:39, and an exit at 12:44. He looked at Graham directly. The digital credential log for that same window shows nothing, because someone deleted it. But they didn't know about the relay log, because nobody knows about the relay log except the people who maintain this building. Harriet Caldwell leaned forward. Let me see that. Daniel walked around the table and handed her his phone. She looked at the photographs carefully. Not quickly. She scrolled through each one, zooming in on the timestamps, the serial numbers, the installation date on the unit's identification plate. She was thorough in the way that people who have spent long careers in boardrooms are thorough, because they have learned that the details other people overlook are almost always the ones that matter. 2009 installation, she said half to herself. Original building system. Yes, ma'am. And this has been logging continuously. The power source is independent. The log buffer holds 18 months of data. I've checked it twice a year during building maintenance inspections. It's never failed. Harriet looked up at Graham, and the look she gave him was the kind of look that does not require a single word to convey its meaning. Graham's jaw was tight. One relay log from an obsolete mechanical system is not evidence of anything. Door triggers malfunction. Timestamps drift. What this man is presenting is completely unverifiable without an independent, I'll verify it, Harriet said quietly. Graham stopped talking. I'll request an independent facilities audit before this vote proceeds, she continued. I have the authority to do that under Section 9 of our governance structure. The vote will be postponed pending review. She looked around the table. Does anyone object? The room was very still. 2 board members looked at Graham. Neither spoke. A third looked down at the table. A fourth, a man in his 70s at the far end, whom Daniel didn't recognize, folded his hands and said, I'll second the motion for postponement. Graham's voice, when it came, was quiet and very flat. This is a mistake. Harriet looked at him with remarkable calm. Maybe. She set Daniel's phone down on the table in front of her. But it's my mistake to make. Graham stood up. He straightened his coat. He looked at Daniel once more, a long, measured look that Daniel held without flinching, and then he walked toward the door. He paused in the doorway. You have no idea what you've stepped into, he said. Not loudly, almost conversationally. like someone pointing out a hazard in the road. "Probably not," Daniel said. "But I know what I stepped into last night, and I know I'd do it again." Graham left. The door closed. The room exhaled. Natalie looked across the table at Daniel, and for a moment, her composed, calculated expression dropped just enough to show something underneath it. Something that might have been relief. "Well," Harriet Caldwell said, picking up Daniel's phone and beginning to go through the photographs again. "I suppose we have some work to do." Daniel's phone buzzed in his hand. He had given Harriet his photos from cloud backup on her own tablet by then, so he had his phone again. The buzzing was a text from Mrs. Garland. "Sophie's awake, making her breakfast. She wants to know if you're okay. She said she had a dream you were in an adventure." Daniel stood at the back of the boardroom while Harriet and 2 other board members began the process of formalizing the postponement motion, and he read that text 3 times. He typed back, "Tell her I'm okay. Tell her I'll be home soon. Tell her the adventure is almost over." He looked up at the room, at the people around that table, at the morning light coming through the windows, at the city below, going about its ordinary business, entirely unaware of what had just happened on the 7th floor of this building. He thought about Claire. I thought about her in a recovery room somewhere in Mercy Regional, unconscious, monitored, surrounded by machines and medical professionals, and the sterile efficiency of a hospital morning, with no idea what was happening in her company in the hours since she'd gone under. With no idea that the man she had put on the form had driven back to her building in his battered SUV and found the thing that changed everything. He thought about what she had said. "You chose my life before you knew whether helping me would benefit you." The postponement motion passed at 7:14 a.m. The Helixor acquisition vote did not happen. And the investigation that would eventually unravel everything started 2 hours later when Harriet Caldwell called a forensic audit firm she had worked with for 20 years and told them she needed them in Charlotte by noon. But first, at 7:22 in the morning, Daniel Mercer walked out of the Asteron building, sat down in his parked SUV, and just breathed for a minute. He was exhausted in the particular way that happens when you have been running on adrenaline and moral clarity for 8 consecutive hours, and both of them have just run out at the same time. His hands were shaking slightly. He noticed this the way he noticed everything, without drama, as a fact to be acknowledged and then dealt with. He had $43 in his checking account. He had possibly just destroyed his career at the only company that had ever really valued his particular kind of competence. He had turned down $500,000 because of something he was trying to teach a 9-year-old girl about character. He leaned his head back against the headrest and closed his eyes. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. Then something made him answer. "Mr. Mercer." The voice was female, professional, and moving fast. "My name is Agent Diana Reyes, FBI Financial Crimes Division. I'm calling because we've been monitoring the Asteron Helixor acquisition for approximately 90 days as part of a broader investigation into securities manipulation. We became aware approximately 40 minutes ago of the board postponement and the existence of a mechanical relay log that appears to document unauthorized after-hours access to executive spaces." A brief pause. "We'd like to speak with you." Daniel opened his eyes. He stared at the ceiling of his SUV. "Today," he said. "This morning, if possible." He exhaled slowly. "Can I go home and shower first?" A pause, and then, surprising him, Agent Reyes said, "Yes, take an hour. You've earned it." He almost laughed. He didn't quite, but it was close. He started the SUV. He thought about Sophie. I thought about how he was going to explain any part of this to a 9-year-old without either terrifying her or making her worry about money, which she was already too good at detecting. He thought about Claire, the way she had looked in that trauma bay, the way she had held the pen, the way she had written his name without hesitation. He pulled out of the parking garage onto the Charlotte Street into the ordinary Monday morning and drove home. On the passenger seat where Claire had sat the night before, where she had gripped the door handle and kept her eyes open and talked to him about board structures and data manipulation, and the evidence she'd spent 4 months gathering, there was a folded piece of notebook paper. Sophie's spelling homework from last Friday. The words were in her careful, deliberate 9-year-old handwriting, each letter slightly larger than it needed to be, like she was determined to make sure each one counted. Daniel glanced at it at a red light. The word at the top of the list, the first one she'd practiced, was honest. He drove home. Behind him on the 7th floor of the Asteron building, Harriet Caldwell was on the phone with a forensic auditor. Natalie Brooks was building a timeline. 2 board members were quietly calling their own attorneys. And in a server room that no one thought mattered on a mechanical relay unit that had been logging quietly and faithfully since 2009, a small display continued blinking its steady record of every door that had ever opened and closed in Daniel Mercer's building. Patient. Thorough. Waiting to be read by the right person. The way the truth usually waits. It doesn't shout. It doesn't chase you. It just stays there in the place where you left it until someone who knows where to look decides to look. And when they do, everything changes. The forensic audit team arrived at Asteron at 12:07 p.m. By 2:30, they had identified 19 separate instances of manipulated data entries in the Diagnostic Division's internal performance reports, each one made through a secondary access account. A ghost credential created 8 months earlier under a name that didn't correspond to any active employee. By 4:20, they had traced the ghost credential to a creation event on the executive network. The creation event was logged under Graham Voss's administrator account. At 4:47 p.m., Graham Voss's attorney called Natalie Brooks and asked about the possibility of a voluntary cooperation agreement with federal investigators. Natalie said she would pass the message along. Then she called Daniel. How was home by then? He had showered. He had eaten a bowl of cereal standing at the kitchen counter because it was the fastest thing available. He had picked Sophie up from school at o'clock, and she had immediately known something was different about him. Not the tired, which was familiar, but the other thing, the something happened quality that children are far better at detecting than adults give them credit for. She had looked up at him in the car line and said, "Dad, what happened?" And he had said, "It's a long story." And she had said, "Good. I like long stories." He was sitting on the couch next to her. Both of them in the particular comfortable quiet of people who know each other completely. Sophie doing her homework with the TV on low in the background when Natalie called. "It was Graham," Natalie said. "The ghost credential traces back to his administrator account. The forensic team found 19 manipulated data entries. The FBI already knew about most of them. They've been building a parallel case. Your relay log was the piece they needed to connect the after-hours access to the deletion of the credential record. Without that, Graham's attorney could have argued the data manipulation was an internal error. With it," she paused. "With it, there's a documented cover-up. That changes everything." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "How's Claire?" he asked. A pause from Natalie too, like she'd been expecting a different question. "She's conscious," Natalie said. "As of an hour ago, she's asking questions." Another pause. "She's asking about you." Sophie looked up from her homework and mouthed the word, who Daniel held up one finger. "Tell her I found what she was looking for," he said into the phone. "Tell her it's handled. She's going to want to talk to you. Tell her to rest first." Natalie made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. "You're going to tell Claire Whitmore what to do." "Someone has to," Daniel said. He hung up. Sophie was watching him with the particular focused attention she deployed when she had decided something was worth understanding completely. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. Was that about the emergency last night?" He looked at her. "Yeah, it was. Is the lady okay?" "The one Mrs. Garland said was in the hospital." "She's going to be fine." Sophie thought about this for a moment, her pencil tapping lightly on her homework paper. "Did you help her?" Daniel looked at his daughter, her careful, serious face, her grandmother's dark eyes, the small gap in her front teeth that the braces appointment was going to fix, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not pride exactly, something quieter than that, something that felt like landing. "I tried," he said. Sophie nodded slowly the way she nodded when she was filing something away for later. Then she looked back down at her homework. "Good," she said. Like it was simple. Like it was the only possible answer. And in that moment, in that ordinary living room, in that ordinary house, on an extraordinary Tuesday morning that had somehow become Tuesday afternoon, Daniel Mercer understood that it had been. It really had been that simple. Everything else, the $500,000, he'd refused the career threat. He'd absorbed the relay log, the board vote, the federal investigation, now spiraling outward from a single night's worth of decisions. All of it had come from one moment in a dark conference room when he'd found a woman on the floor and simply decided not to walk away. No calculation, no strategy, no thought about what it might cost him or earn him. Just a decision made in the dark when no one was watching that turned out to be the most important decision of his life. Sophie's pencil moved across her homework paper. The TV murmured in the background. Outside, Charlotte continued its ordinary afternoon. And somewhere in Mercy Regional Hospital, Claire Whitmore opened her eyes fully for the first time since surgery, looked at the ceiling of her recovery room, and asked the nurse to bring her the authorization paperwork so she could check something. The nurse brought the clipboard. Claire found the emergency contact line. She read the name she had written. Daniel Mercer. She held the clipboard for a long moment. Then she said, "Can someone tell me how to reach him?" The nurse who brought Claire the clipboard was named Rosa, and she had been working recovery at Mercy Regional for 11 years, which meant she had seen every variety of patient that a hospital could produce. The frightened ones, the angry ones, the ones who cried without knowing they were crying, and the ones who went very still and very quiet, in a way that was somehow more difficult to watch than all the others combined. Claire Whitmore was the still and quiet kind. She had been conscious for 40 minutes. She had answered every neurological assessment question correctly, clearly, and without hesitation, which the attending physician had described as remarkable, given the grade and location of the rupture. She had asked 3 medical questions about her own condition that were precise enough to make the resident uncomfortable. She had asked once about the time, registered the answer without visible reaction, and then asked for the authorization paperwork. Rosa had brought the clipboard. Now Claire was holding it the way someone holds something they are not entirely sure is real. "Can someone tell me how to reach him?" she said. Rosa looked at the name on the form. "I can try the number listed if you'd like." "Please." Rosa stepped out. Claire set the clipboard on her lap and looked at the ceiling. Her head ached in a way that was unlike any headache she had experienced before. Not sharp, but deep, like something that had rearranged itself and not entirely settled back into place. The doctors told her this was normal. She accepted that the way she accepted most things she could not control by filing it and moving on. What she could not file was the previous 8 hours. She remembered the conference room. She remembered the documents spread across the table the moment when the final piece had slid into place after 4 months of building toward it. The particular cold clarity of finally holding proof that someone had been systematically lying to her board. She remembered reaching for the water glass. She remembered the glass hitting the floor. And then she remembered Daniel, not Graham, not Natalie, not any of the people whose job it was to be there when something went wrong. Daniel Mercer in his work uniform crouching beside her on the floor of her own conference room saying, "Look at me," in a voice that was not unkind and not afraid. Saying, "Stay awake." Claire in a rainstorm while she was losing the ability to form complete sentences. Carrying her through a lobby she had walked through 1,000 times without once looking at the ceiling, noticing the light, or thinking about what the building felt like from the inside. She thought about the form. She thought about the moment she had picked up the pen with her good hand and looked at that line and felt with absolute clarity, in the way that certain truths become visible only when everything else has been stripped away, that there was only one name that belonged there. Rosa came back in. He answered, "He'd like to speak with you when you're ready. He says..." She checked her notepad. "He says to rest first." Something moved across Claire's face that Rosa would later describe to her colleague as the first thing resembling a smile she'd seen from that particular patient. "Of course he does," Claire said. She picked up the phone anyway. It rang twice. Then Daniel's voice, quieter than she remembered it from the night before, steadier than anyone had a right to sound on no sleep. "You were supposed to rest," he said. "I'll rest when I have answers." She paused. Tell me what happened. So he told her. He told it straight, without editorializing the way he described building problems, sequentially, factually, with the relevant details, and none of the unnecessary ones. The relay log. The timestamp at 12:38 a.m. The deletion of the digital credential record. Natalie. The boardroom. Harriet Caldwell. The postponement. The forensic audit team arriving at noon. The 19 manipulated data entries. The ghost credential traced back to Graham's administrator account. The FBI already building a parallel case. Graham's attorney calling Natalie by late afternoon. Claire listened without interrupting. When he finished, the line was quiet for a moment. The relay log, she said finally. I didn't even know that system existed. Most people don't. You did. It's my building. She was quiet again. Then, you went back there, after sitting in that waiting room all night, after Graham. She stopped. Did he threaten you? He made me an offer. How much? A pause. 500,000. The number landed between them on the phone line like a stone. Daniel. It wasn't a real choice, he said simply. $500,000 is always a real choice. Not when the alternative is something I couldn't explain to Sophie. Claire didn't answer immediately. He could hear the particular silence of a hospital room in the background, the low hum of monitoring equipment, the distant sound of corridor activity, the specific acoustic quality of a space designed to contain difficult things. How is she? Claire asked. Sophie. The question surprised him. Not because it was inappropriate, but because it was the first time Claire Whitmore had ever asked him a personal question that had nothing to do with the situation at hand. She's good, he said. She told me she likes long stories. She's 9 and she already sounds smarter than most people I hire. This time Daniel did smile. He was sitting on his couch, Sophie asleep in her room down the hall, the house quiet in the particular way it got after she went to bed. Present familiar, like it was breathing with him. Get some rest, he said. The investigation is moving. Natalie has it. Harriet has it. You don't have to hold it tonight. I've been holding it for 4 months. I know. You can put it down now. Another pause. Longer. You're telling me to put it down, she said. Half statement, half something she was still processing. Yes. Nobody tells me to put things down. I know that too. The line was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to be something. Then Claire said very quietly, Thank you, Daniel. He said, Sleep. And she did not argue, which he recognized as possibly the most remarkable thing that had happened in a 24-hour period that had contained several remarkable things. He set his phone down on the couch cushion beside him and sat in the quiet of his house and let himself be tired for a few minutes before he went to bed. 3 weeks was how long it took. 3 weeks of federal investigators moving through Asteron's systems with the particular methodical thoroughness of people who had seen this kind of thing before and knew exactly which rocks to look under. 3 weeks of board meetings that Daniel was not invited to and did not need to attend. 3 weeks of Natalie calling him every few days with updates delivered in her precise, measured voice like she was reading from a brief but had decided he deserved to hear it in real language. Graham Voss resigned on day 11. He did it quietly through his attorney with a statement that cited personal reasons and a desire to support the company's transition during a difficult period. The statement was 2 sentences long. It contained no acknowledgement of anything. 4 other executives were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. 2 of them had direct connections to the Helix ordeal. The other 2 had known about the data manipulation and said nothing, which the federal investigators treated as essentially the same thing. The Helixor acquisition was formally suspended on day 16. The FBI's parallel investigation, which had apparently been running for 3 months before Daniel's relay log, provided the piece that connected the inside access to the data deletion, went public on day 19. The news coverage was significant enough that Daniel saw it on the television at the auto shop while he was waiting to get the inspection sticker he'd been putting off on his SUV, and he watched the reporter standing outside Asteron's building and described the scene in language that sounded nothing like anything Daniel recognized, which was how news coverage worked. Sophie saw a segment about it at her friend Madison's house and came home that night and said, "Dad, was that your company?" He said yes. She thought about it for a moment and said, "Did you know about it?" He said he'd found some of it out. She looked at him with those dark, careful eyes and said, "Is that why you were tired for a week?" He said yes again. She nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, and went to do her homework, which Daniel understood as her version of deciding she trusted him to have handled it correctly. On day 22, Natalie called and told him Claire was being discharged from the hospital that morning. On day 23, Claire called him herself. "I need to see you," she said. No preamble, no small talk, pure Claire. "When?" "Today, if you can." "I have a thing at Sophie's school at 3. Before 3. He drove to Natalie's office, which was where Claire had arranged to meet neutral ground professional setting. The kind of choice that told Daniel Claire was being careful about what kind of meeting this was going to be. He wore a clean shirt and his better jacket, which Sophie had inspected before he left and declared acceptable. Claire was already there when he arrived. She looked different from the last time he had seen her in person, which was in a trauma bay 3 weeks earlier. She was in a dark blazer, her posture perfectly straight, her expression composed. She looked like the person he passed in the lobby every morning. She looked like the CEO. But her eyes were different. Daniel couldn't have said exactly how. They were the same dark brown, the same sharp focus. But something around the edges of them had changed the way a landscape changes after a storm has moved through it. Still recognizable, still itself, but rearranged in some way that you couldn't articulate precisely. She stood when he came in. He hadn't expected that. "Daniel," she said. "Claire." He sat down across from her. "How are you feeling?" "Better than I have any right to." She paused. "The neurologist says the recovery has been cleaner than they expected. Apparently being in excellent physical condition and extremely stubborn are both medically advantageous." I could have told him the second part. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. "I imagine you could have." She folded her hands on the table. "I want to talk to you about what happens next. For you." "Okay. I'd like to offer you a promotion." She held up one hand before he could speak. "Let me finish. Director of Corporate Resilience and Facilities Risk. It's a new position. I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks. The premise is this. The crisis that almost destroyed this company was possible in part because nobody was thinking about the building's information systems as a coherent security layer. You were. You just didn't have the authority or the resources to act on what you knew." She paused. "I want to change that. Real salary. Real benefits. Real authority. The position reports through normal corporate channels. You would earn it, not receive it. And there would be enough flexibility in the structure that you could stop missing evenings." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "I want to think about it," he said. Claire blinked. He suspected this was not the response she had prepared for. "Of course." "It's not a no," he said. "I just want to think about it." Most people don't ask to think about a significant promotion. Most people aren't me. She studied him. "What would you need to think about? Whether I've actually earned it yet, whether the position is real, or whether it's gratitude dressed up as a title, whether taking it means I owe you something I'm not aware of yet." He met her eyes directly. "I'm not questioning your intentions. I'm asking myself honest questions." Claire was quiet for a moment. "That answer," she said carefully, "is exactly why the position would be better with you in it than anyone else I could hire." She paused. "For what it's worth, it's real. I've run the structural analysis. Asteron has a genuine vulnerability in the intersection between physical facilities systems and digital security architecture. You identified it accidentally. I want someone who understands both to manage it deliberately. The fact that you're the one who identified it is relevant. It's not the only reason." "What's the other reason?" She was quiet for a moment. And then she said something that Daniel had not expected. "Because I trust you," she said, simply, without ceremony. And I don't say that about very many people. I've learned not to. She looked down at her folded hands, then back up. That night I was terrified. I've been terrified before, and I've handled it alone every single time because that's what I do. That's what I've always done. I handle things alone because I've learned that depending on people creates the kind of vulnerability that gets used against you. A pause. You were the first person in a very long time who made me feel like depending on someone wasn't a liability. And I know that's not a corporate qualification, but it's what's true. The room was quiet for a moment. Daniel looked at her. At the composed, careful, brilliant, frightened person underneath the CEO. The one who had written his name on a form in a trauma bay, not because it was the rational choice, but because it was the only honest one. "I'll take the position," he said. Claire let out a breath that was not quite a sigh. "Just like that, I thought you needed to think about it. You answered my questions." She shook her head slowly. "You're a strange man. You've told me that before. It keeps being true." Natalie appeared in the doorway with 2 coffees and the expression of someone who had been listening from the hall and decided this was a reasonable moment to re-enter. She set the coffees down, looked between the 2 of them and said, "Do I need to draw up paperwork?" "Yes," Claire said. "Good." Natalie sat down. "Because I've already drafted it." Daniel picked up the coffee. It was better than the vending machine kind. That felt significant in the particular way that small ordinary improvements feel significant after a period of difficulty. But it was what happened the following Saturday that Daniel would remember most. Claire had called him Thursday evening to go over a few details about the new position structure. The call had lasted 40 minutes, which was 35 minutes longer than he'd expected, and covered in addition to the corporate structure. The topics of Sophie's school, the best breakfast places in East Charlotte, and whether Daniel thought the mechanical relay system could be integrated into Asteron's formal security architecture without disrupting the building's other systems. He had answered all 4, with varying degrees of confidence. At the end of the call, Claire had said almost as an afterthought, and Daniel was already learning that her most significant statements often came packaged as afterthoughts. "Sophie mentioned she wants to learn how buildings work. You told her what you do, and she looked it up." She looked up building systems at 9 years old. Apparently, she found an article about mechanical engineering and decided it was, quote, "more interesting than I made it sound." Daniel was not sure whether to be proud or slightly offended. "Natalie has a daughter Sophie's age," Claire said. "She takes her to the Science Museum on Saturdays sometimes. I wondered if—" She stopped. "I don't actually know how to phrase this." "Claire?" "Yes. Are you asking if you can come to breakfast on Saturday?" A pause. "That seems like a reasonable way to interpret it," she said. 7:30, he said. "Sophie picks the place. Fair warning, she likes diners, not restaurants. She believes waitstaff who refill your coffee without being asked are a sign of a good person. That's a more reliable metric than most corporate reference checks. She's 9. She's already figured out what most executives spend their careers missing." Another pause. This one softer than the previous ones. "I'll be there at 7:30, Claire said. She was there at 7:25, which Daniel suspected was the first time in a decade Claire Whitmore had arrived anywhere early without a competitive reason for doing so. Sophie opened the front door, looked at Claire for exactly 2 seconds and said, "You're the lady from the hospital, right? The one Dad rescued." "Sophie," Daniel started. "I didn't need rescuing," Claire said. "I needed a ride." Sophie considered this. "That's what my dad says when I carry his groceries, and he doesn't want to admit he needed help." There was a beat of silence. Then Claire said, "You're exactly what I expected." "Is that good?" Sophie asked. "Very," Claire said. Sophie stepped back from the door. "I picked Lou's Diner. They refill your coffee before you even finish the cup. That means the waitress is a good person." Claire glanced at Daniel. He spread his hands. "I told you." They sat in a booth at Lou's Diner on a Saturday morning, and Sophie interrogated Claire about what it was like to run a company with the particular systematic curiosity of a child who has decided that an interesting adult is a resource not to be wasted. She asked whether Claire had always wanted to be a CEO, whether it was lonely at the top like people said, and whether Claire knew that the building she worked in had a system in the basement that her dad had used to save the whole company. Claire answered the first two questions thoughtfully. On the third, she looked across the table at Daniel and said, "I know about that system now, yes. Dad says it just logs door events," Sophie said. "But I looked it up, and it's actually called an Integrated Relay Control Unit, and it was originally designed for HVAC sequencing optimization." She looked at Claire. "Did you know your building has a lot of systems that people don't pay attention to?" "I'm learning that," Claire said. "Your father is an excellent teacher." Sophie looked at Daniel with an expression that combined pride with mild vindication, as if he had finally, after considerable delay, received credit for something she had been aware of for years. "He is," she said. "He's pretty good." Daniel looked at his coffee. "I thought about the night 3 weeks earlier when he had been on this same block driving through rain with a billionaire in his passenger seat, talking about Sophie, to keep both of them focused, to keep Claire awake, to fill the 8 minutes between a dark parking lot and an emergency bay with something human enough to hold on to. He had not in that moment imagined this. He had not imagined any of it. He had just driven. The waitress came by and refilled Claire's coffee before she asked, and Sophie noticed immediately and looked at Daniel with quiet satisfaction. He gave her a small nod. She smiled and went back to her pancakes. Claire wrapped both hands around the warm mug and looked out at the Saturday morning street, and Daniel watched her face in the peripheral way he'd learned to watch things, not staring, just aware. And he saw something there that he had not seen before. Not in the lobby, not in the boardroom, not even in the hospital. She looked like someone who had temporarily set down a very heavy thing. Not dropped it, not abandoned it, just set it down. For one Saturday morning. In a diner, where the waitress refilled your coffee without being asked. Daniel thought that was probably enough for now. Some things build slowly. The important ones usually do. He picked up his own coffee and looked at his daughter, who was now asking Claire whether she thought buildings could have personalities, and Claire without hesitation saying she thought this one probably did. And just like that, in that ordinary booth, on that ordinary morning, in a city that had no idea any of this had happened, something began. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, the way the best things begin. The way a relay switch closes in a dark basement, and the whole system comes back on. One small connection, everything that follows. Months have a way of moving differently after a crisis. Before the night, Daniel carried Claire through the lobby. Time had moved in the predictable rhythm of single-parenthood school pickups and grocery runs and overtime shifts, and the constant low hum of financial calculation that never fully went quiet. Each week looked approximately like the last. Each month was a variation on the same theme. He had not been unhappy. He had simply been moving forward in the particular determined way of a man who has decided that forward is enough. After time moved differently. Not faster exactly, more textured, like something had changed in the resolution. He started the new position on a Monday in late November, 8 weeks after the night everything happened. His office, an actual office with a door and a window, and his name on a placard outside. It was on the 4th floor. Not the executive floor. He hadn't asked for the executive floor, and Claire hadn't offered it, which told him she understood something important about who he was. The 4th floor was close enough to the building systems to feel connected to them, high enough to have a reasonable view, and far enough from the executive boardroom that people didn't mistake him for something he hadn't yet become. He spent the first 2 weeks doing what he always did in a new situation, learning. He went through every building system Asteron owned with fresh eyes, not as the man who maintained them, but as the man responsible for understanding how they intersected with the company's security and risk architecture. He found 7 additional vulnerabilities in the first 10 days. None as significant as the relay log situation, but each one a reminder that the most dangerous gaps in any system are the ones that fall between categories. The things nobody owns because nobody is quite sure whose job they are. He wrote a 12-page report. He sent it to Claire on a Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, she had forwarded it to the board's risk committee with a note that said, "This is why I created the position." Natalie sent him a text that said simply, "She never forwards things same day. You should feel good about that. He felt good about that. But the thing he felt best about happened every evening at 5:30 when he locked his office door and drove to Sophie's school for pickup, which he had not been able to do reliably in 3 years. The first time he was there, standing in the parent pickup line with other parents. Normal, unhurried, not calculating overtime against a babysitter's hourly rate. Sophie came through the school doors and saw him and stopped walking for just a moment, like she needed to verify that it was real. Then she walked to the car and got in and said, "You're here." "I'm here," he said. "You're on time." "I am." She buckled her seatbelt and looked out the window. "This is better," she said in the matter-of-fact way that children state things that adults spend years trying to find language for. He pulled out of the pickup line. "Yeah," he said. "It is." Claire came to Lou's Diner 3 Saturdays in a row. The first time Sophie had asked her 11 questions about corporate leadership, 4 questions about brain surgery, and 1 question about whether Claire had ever cried at work, which made Daniel want to disappear into the booth cushion. Claire had answered all 16 without hesitation. On the last one she said, "Once, when I found out the company I'd spent 8 years building was being manipulated from the inside by someone I trusted. I cried for about 4 minutes in my car in the parking garage, and then I went back upstairs." Sophie thought about this. "That's actually kind of impressive." "I thought so," Claire said. The second Saturday. Sophie brought a list of questions she had prepared in advance, which told Daniel she had been thinking about the previous conversation all week. The list covered topics including how buildings stay structurally sound in earthquakes, whether CEOs get lonely, and what Claire's favorite book was. Claire answered them in order. On the last one, she said a novel Daniel had never heard of by an author he didn't recognize, which Sophie immediately wrote down on a separate piece of paper to look up later. The third Saturday, Sophie didn't bring a list. She just talked, and Claire talked back. And Daniel sat between them and drank his coffee and listened to his daughter and the most intimidating woman in Charlotte discuss whether the school cafeteria's ventilation system was up to code. Sophie had noticed the air felt different on hot days, which Claire said was a valid observation, and he felt something so unfamiliar that it took him a moment to identify it. It was peace. Not happiness exactly, though it was close to that. Something more structural than happiness. Something that felt like a foundation being poured correctly slowly in the right weather by someone who knew what they were doing. I thought about his wife. He thought about her the way he always did, not with the acute grief of the first 2 years, but with the particular tenderness of someone who has learned to carry a person they loved inside their daily life without it being a wound. He thought about what she would have made of all of this. He suspected she would have laughed. She had always said he was the kind of man who would accidentally become important by simply refusing to be anything other than exactly himself. She had been right. She usually was. It was the 4th Saturday when things shifted. Not dramatically. Not with a declaration or a confrontation or any of the mechanisms that Daniel associated with things changing. It shifted. Temperature shifts in a room when someone opens a window. Gradually, then all at once, and you realize halfway through that it's already different. Sophie had gone to the restroom at Lou's, which she did with the unhurried confidence of a child who has decided this particular diner is her territory. And Claire and Daniel were alone at the booth for the first time across all 4 Saturdays, and the absence of a 9-year-old moderating the conversation made something in the air between them become more itself. Claire had her coffee. Daniel had his. The diner was doing its normal Saturday business around them. "Can I ask you something?" Claire said. "Go ahead." "The night I wrote your name on the form." She looked at her coffee mug. "I've been thinking about it. Not the decision. I understand why I made it. I've thought about the moment itself. What I felt." She paused. "I was terrified. And I was alone in a way that I've been alone for years. But that night, it was more visible to me than it had ever been. That I had built something enormous and had almost no one I trusted inside it." She looked up. "And then you were there. And you were so steady. Like nothing about the situation was going to change who you were. I found that more frightening than the aneurysm, honestly." Daniel looked at her. "Why frightening?" "Because I didn't know what to do with it." She held his eyes. I've spent 20 years learning how to manage people, how to read them, how to position myself relative to them. I'm very good at it. You don't respond to any of the normal signals. You're not impressed by authority. You're not intimidated by money. You're not maneuvering for position. A pause. You're just present. It's deeply disorienting. I'll try to be more manageable, he said. She almost smiled. Don't. The word landed quietly between them. Sophie came back from the restroom and slid into the booth and immediately said, "What did I miss?" with the instinct of a child who has learned that the most interesting conversations happen in her absence. "Nothing," Daniel and Claire said simultaneously. Sophie looked between them with the particular expression of someone who is 9 years old and already too perceptive for everyone's comfort. "Okay," she said slowly, and picked up her orange juice and said nothing more. But that evening after Claire had left and Daniel was washing the breakfast dishes, and Sophie was at the kitchen table doing homework, she said without looking up, "I like her dad." "Yeah, she's real." Sophie turned a page. "Some adults aren't real. They're like performing being an adult. She's actually just being herself." Daniel dried a glass and set it in the cabinet. "When did you get this smart?" "I was always this smart. You just don't notice because you're my dad." He put the dish towel and looked at his daughter at the kitchen table. This small, serious, extraordinary person, and thought that his wife had been right about a lot of things, and the most accurate of all of them was that Sophie was going to be fine. Better than fine. She was going to be remarkable. It was a Tuesday in January when the next crisis hit. Not a physical one this time. Not a medical emergency, or a corporate conspiracy, or a powerful man in a cashmere coat making threats in a hospital waiting room. Something quieter, more personal, and in some ways, harder. Daniel was in his office at 9:15 in the morning when Natalie knocked on his open door with the expression of someone carrying information they would prefer not to be carrying. "Do you have a few minutes?" she said. "Sure." He set down the building systems audit he'd been reviewing. "Sit down." She sat. She folded her hands on her lap, the way she did when she was being precise. "There's a development I think you should know about before it hits the general news cycle. Probably this afternoon." She paused. "Graham Voss has entered into a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors. Part of that agreement involves him providing testimony about individuals who were aware of or participated in the data manipulation." Another pause. "His attorney has provided a preliminary witness list to both the prosecution and the defense." Daniel waited. "Your name is on it," Natalie said. The room was very quiet. "As a witness," she said quickly. "Not as a subject. You're not implicated in anything, but they'll want a formal deposition. Your interaction with Claire that night, what she told you in the car, your decision to go back to the building, the relay log, all of it will be part of the record." Daniel looked at his desk. "Also," Natalie said, and her voice changed slightly, just enough. "Claire's name is on the list as well, obviously. And in his preliminary statement, Graham's attorney has characterized certain aspects of her investigation and her conversation with you in the car as evidence of a prior relationship, a personal one." Daniel went very still. "He's implying," Natalie said carefully, "that Claire's decision to name you as her emergency contact was not made under the medical duress she has described. That there was a pre-existing relationship that influenced her judgment." "That's not true. I know it's not true. We had spoken approximately 4 times in 6 years before that night. I know that too." Natalie held his eyes. "But Graham's legal strategy requires a narrative in which Claire's actions that night appear irrational or compromised. Claiming personal bias is how they'll try to create reasonable doubt around her credibility as a witness." She paused. "It's a legal tactic. It's not a reflection of reality, but I need you to be prepared for the fact that it's going to be reported. Probably today." Daniel sat back in his chair. I thought about Claire hearing this. He thought about what she would do with it, the precise, controlled way she would absorb it, and what it would cost her underneath the control. He thought about a woman who had spent 20 years building walls high enough to keep betrayal out, and what it would feel like to have the narrative about her most unguarded moment. The moment she had been most purely, most vulnerably herself, twisted into something strategic and suspect. "Does she know?" he asked. "Her attorney is briefing her right now." He stood up. "I need to talk to her." "Daniel." "Not because of the legal situation. Because she's going to hear this, and she's going to pull every wall back up, and I think that would be a loss." He looked at Natalie steadily. "She spent 20 years building armor. She set some of it down. I don't want this to be the thing that makes her put it all back on." Natalie looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "Her office. She's there now." He walked to the elevator. The ride to the 7th floor was less than 30 seconds, but he used it to clear his head, the same way he cleared his head before diagnosing a complex building problem. Setting aside everything that wasn't directly relevant, focusing on what the situation actually required. What it required was honesty. He was good at that. Claire's assistant, a young man named Patrick, who had clearly been briefed on not letting people through today, looked up when Daniel stepped off the elevator and said, "She's in a meeting. Tell her it's Daniel." Patrick hesitated. Then he reached for his desk phone, said 2 sentences into it, and looked up. "Go ahead." Claire was standing at the far side of her office with her phone in her hand, and the expression she wore when she was managing something that was threatening to exceed the container she'd built for it. Her attorney, a sharp-featured man Daniel recognized from the hospital waiting room months earlier, was seated at her conference table with a laptop open. She looked at Daniel when he came in. "I was going to call you," she said. "I know." He looked at the attorney. "Can you give us a few minutes?" The attorney looked at Claire. She nodded once. He closed his laptop and left. The office door clicked shut. "It's a tactic," Daniel said. Natalie explained it. "They need to discredit you as a witness, so they're going to make that night look like something it wasn't." "I know what it is." Her voice was even, controlled. The voice she wore like armor. "Claire, I've handled worse than this. I know you have." He took a step toward her. "I'm not here because I think you can't handle it. I'm here because I don't want you to have to." He held her eyes. "You spent 4 months building a case against someone who was robbing your company, and you did it alone because you didn't trust anyone enough to share it. You got sick alone in your conference room at midnight, and you managed to be afraid of dying while simultaneously worrying about a board vote, because that's how completely you've learned to function without depending on anyone." He paused. "You wrote my name on that form. Not because of a prior relationship, not because of bias. Because for one moment in the worst moment, you made an honest choice about who you trusted." Another pause. "Don't let him take that from you." The room was very quiet. Claire looked at him with those dark, sharp eyes that had rearranged something around their edges. Her composure was intact. It was always intact. But underneath it, he could see the precise effort it was costing her. "It's going to be in the news today," she said. "Yes. People are going to believe it. Some people will. The people who know you won't. Most people don't know me. Then this is an opportunity for more people to." Something shifted in her expression. Not breaking Claire Whitmore did not break, but bending. The difference between a wall and a door. "You are," she said quietly, "genuinely the most infuriating person I have ever met. You've told me I'm strange. Now I'm infuriating. We're making progress." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. "How are you doing that?" "Doing what?" "Making this feel less like a catastrophe." "Because it isn't one," he said simply. "It's a legal tactic by a man who already lost. The difference between what he's implying and what actually happened is on record in the relay log, in Natalie's documentation in the hospital records. The truth is documented. We documented it." He held her eyes. "We did that. You and me and Natalie and a 40-year-old relay system that nobody thought mattered. It's all there." Claire held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "I need to go back to work." "I know. I have 3 calls and a deposition prep and a board communication to draft before noon." "Then I'll let you get to it." He turned toward the door. "Daniel." He stopped. She was looking at him with something he had not quite seen on her face before. Not gratitude, he'd seen gratitude. Not relief, he'd seen that too. This was something more fundamental. Something that sat underneath those things. "Thank you," she said. "Not for tonight, for all of it. For the way you—" She stopped, started again. "For being the same person every time." He looked at her. "That's the only way I know how to do it." "I know," she said. "That's why it matters." He left. In the elevator going down, he thought that was possibly the most important conversation he had ever had in a building he maintained, which was saying something given the past few months. The news broke at 2:47 that afternoon. It was exactly what Natalie had predicted, the framing that Graham's legal team had constructed, the implication of a prior relationship. The suggestion that Claire's emergency contact decision had been emotionally, rather than circumstantially motivated. The headline was careful enough to avoid outright accusation, which Daniel had learned was how this kind of damage was done most effectively. You didn't assert. You suggested. You let the reader's imagination complete the sentence. His phone buzzed 17 times in the first hour. Colleagues. A reporter whose number he didn't recognize. Natalie. Sophie's school, not because anything had happened there, but because Sophie's teacher had seen the news and wanted him to know kindly and carefully that if Sophie encountered anything at school, she had support available. He called Sophie's teacher back first. Then he sat at his desk and read the article once carefully, the same way he read a faulty building report, looking for the specific structural weakness, the point where the narrative departed from documented fact. He found 8. He wrote them down. He sent the list to Natalie. She replied in 4 minutes, already on it. Claire's attorney is filing a formal response at 4 p.m. Also, she says to tell you to stop reading comment sections. He had not been reading comment sections. He put his phone face down on his desk and went back to the building systems audit. 2 weeks later, he was called for his deposition. He sat across a conference table from 2 federal attorneys and Graham Voss's legal team, and he answered every question the same way he answered every question about building systems, directly, specifically, and with reference to documented evidence when it existed. "What did Claire Whitmore say to you in the vehicle?" He told them exactly, as precisely as he could reconstruct it. "Had you and Ms. Whitmore had personal interactions prior to that night beyond normal workplace contact?" Num. "Was your decision to transport her influenced by any personal relationship?" No. "What was your decision influenced by?" "She needed help, and I was there." Graham's attorney leaned forward. "Mr. Mercer, isn't it possible that the trust Ms. Whitmore placed in you, naming you as her emergency contact, a remarkable decision, given your professional distance, reflects a degree of personal feeling that she may not have disclosed?" Daniel looked at him evenly. "She told me herself why she wrote my name," he said. "She said she knew what I did when nobody was watching. She said I chose her life before I knew whether helping her would benefit me." He paused. "That's not personal feeling. That's an assessment of character under pressure. She made a rational decision with the information she had available in a moment when most of her normal decision-making resources were compromised." He kept his eyes on the attorney. "She was right about what she observed. What she wrote on that form was accurate. I'm not sure what ambiguity you're trying to introduce." The attorney looked down at his notes. He didn't ask that question again. The deposition lasted 4 hours. When it was done, Daniel drove to Sophie's school, arrived exactly on time for pickup, and stood in the parent line and felt the specific, uncomplicated relief of ordinary life resuming its ordinary rhythm. Sophie came through the doors, saw him, and said, "How was the deposition?" "You know about the deposition. I heard you tell Natalie you had one today. I know what a deposition is. I'm 9, not 5. She got in the car. "Was it bad?" "No," he said. "I just told the truth." "That's all?" "That's all." She buckled her seatbelt and thought about it. "So, it was basically like when Ms. Patterson asked who broke the classroom window, and I just said it was the kickball, and here is exactly where it bounced." "Exactly like that." "See?" she said. "Easy." He pulled out of the pickup line. Easy. Nothing about the past 4 months had been easy. but somehow told back to him through the lens of his daughter's 9-year-old clarity. It simplified into something that almost fit that description. You knew what happened. You said what happened. You documented what happened. You refused to say something other than what happened when someone offered you enough money to retire and then threatened everything you'd built when that didn't work. Easy. If you were the kind of person who had decided somewhere along the way that the alternative was not actually an alternative. The federal investigation concluded its primary phase in March. Graham Voss accepted a plea agreement on 7 counts, including securities fraud, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. His sentencing was scheduled for June. 2 of the executives who had known about the data manipulation and said nothing accepted separate agreements. The Helixor acquisition was permanently canceled. The diagnostic division, with its accurate valuation restored, became one of Asteron's strongest performing units in the following fiscal year. Harriet Caldwell was elected board chair at the spring meeting, which Natalie described to Daniel as the best possible outcome, and which Claire described with characteristic restraint as appropriate. And in April, on a Wednesday afternoon, that gave no particular indication of being significant. Claire appeared in the doorway of Daniel's 4th-floor office and stood there in a way that was different from her usual appearances, which were purposeful and efficient, and came with an agenda. This one came without an agenda. He looked up from his desk. "Do you have a minute?" she said. "Sure." She came in and sat down in the chair across from his desk, not at the edge of it the way people sit when they're stopping briefly, but settled the way people sit when they've decided they're staying. "I had my final neurological checkup today," she said. He set his pen down. "And clean, full clearance, no lasting deficits." She folded her hands in her lap. The surgeon said it was the cleanest recovery she'd seen from a grade 2 rupture in 12 years of practice. That's incredible news. Yes. She looked at her hands for a moment. On the way out, the receptionist asked whether my emergency contact information was still current. She paused. I looked at the form. Your name is still on it. I never updated it. Daniel waited. She asked if I wanted to change it, Claire said. He held very still. I told her to keep it, Claire said. The office was quiet. He looked at her across the desk. This complicated, extraordinary, carefully constructed person who had spent 2 decades learning to need no one and had written his name on a form at the worst moment of her life and had never, it turned out, found a reason to erase it. Claire, he said. I know what I'm saying, she said. I've thought about it for 6 months. I'm not impulsive. I don't make decisions I haven't examined. A pause. I've examined this one from every direction. The conclusion is the same every time. What's the conclusion? She met his eyes directly the way she had met his eyes across every difficult moment of the past 7 months, the same dark, steady, entirely honest gaze. That the name on that form is right, she said. Not because of that night, not because of what you did in the building, or what you said in the boardroom, or what you said in my office when Graham's story hit the news. Because of all of it. Because of every single ordinary moment between those things. Because of Lou's diner and Sophie, and the way you answered my questions in the car when I was terrified, and the way you told me to rest, and the way you showed up at my office not to manage the situation, but because you didn't want me to put my walls back up. She stopped, took one even breath. You are the most honest person I have ever known, and I have spent my entire adult life believing that kind of honesty was naive, that it was a weakness, that people who led with integrity rather than strategy got used. She paused. You proved every assumption I had wrong, and I am not a person who changes her mind easily, which means when I do, she held his eyes, it matters. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Sophie's going to say she knew. Something broke open in Claire's face, real, unguarded, entirely unlike the CEO, and she laughed. A real one. The kind that surprised her. Or she absolutely will, Claire said. She'll want it on the record. She can have it on the record. He stood up from behind his desk and came around it, and she stood, and they were close in the way of 2 people who have spent 7 months becoming increasingly unable to pretend that the distance between them was professional. "I'm not easy to be around," Claire said. "I'm demanding. I'm private. I work too much. I'm better at running companies than I am at—" She paused. "Most of this." "I know," he said. "I also know you've been showing up at a diner every Saturday for 4 months because my daughter makes you feel like a person and not a title." "She does." And because you're there," she said simply. He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "I know that too." He had known it for a while if he was honest. He had known it the way he knew building systems, not all at once, but gradually through accumulation of evidence, until the picture was too clear to misread. She reached out and touched his arm. Not dramatically, just contact, the simple quiet kind. And he didn't pull back. Because that was the whole of it, really. He had never pulled back. Not in the conference room when he found her on the floor. Not in the elevator when she told him her company might be falling apart. Not in the car when she was losing consciousness, and he kept talking to her about Sophie and the weather and anything that would keep her present. Not in the hospital waiting room when Graham Voss named a number that could have changed his daughter's life. Not in the boardroom with a phone full of photographs and a room full of suits. Not when a legal strategy tried to make honesty look like bias. He had never pulled back, and neither in the end had she. 3 months after that Wednesday afternoon in his office, Sophie found out. Not because either of them told her they had been deciding how to tell her with appropriate care, which Sophie preempted entirely by looking up from dinner one Thursday night and saying, "Are you and Claire together now, like actually together?" Daniel set his fork down. Sophie looked between him and the phone where Claire was on a video call that had started as a work conversation and migrated as their conversations increasingly did into something else. On the phone screen, Claire went very still. "Because," Sophie continued perfectly calm, "I just want to know. I'm not upset. I think it's good. I just want the actual information." Daniel looked at Sophie, then at Claire on the screen. Claire said yes. Sophie nodded slowly, picked up her fork. "I knew in February," she said, "at Lou's, when you both said nothing at the exact same time when I came back from the bathroom." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "I've been waiting for you to figure it out," Sophie said. On the phone screen, Claire made a sound that was unmistakably laughter. "She's remarkable," Claire said. "I know," Daniel said. "She's smarter than both of us combined." "I know that too." Sophie took a bite of her dinner and looked entirely satisfied in the way of someone who has been patient about a foregone conclusion and has finally been vindicated. "Can we go to Lou's on Saturday?" she asked. "Yes," they said. Both of them, at the same time. And that was it. That was the whole of it. A single father who went to work at midnight to fix a broken relay switch because his daughter needed braces. A CEO who collapsed alone in her own conference room at 11:47 and had nobody's name to write on a form. 8 minutes through a Charlotte rainstorm. A pen moving across an emergency contact line with the particular certainty of a choice made when everything else has been stripped away. One name. 2 people who had been in entirely different ways, invisible to each other and to themselves until the night when all the distance between them collapsed into a single necessary moment. Daniel Mercer did not save Claire Whitmore because he wanted something from her world. He saved her because it was what the moment required, and he was the kind of man who showed up for moments without asking what they would cost him first. And Claire wrote his name, not because she was irrational, not because she was compromised, not because of anything Graham Voss or his attorneys or a single news cycle had tried to suggest. She wrote it because it was true. Because it's in the one moment, when all the strategy and armor and careful management of impression fell away, when she had nothing left but the honest question of who she trusted. His was the only name that belonged there. And the thing about a name, written honestly, in the worst moment, by someone who has spent a lifetime being careful with trust, is that it doesn't erase. It stays. The way truth stays when it's documented properly. In relay logs that nobody thought to manipulate because nobody thought they mattered. In a 9-year-old girl who knew in February and waited patiently for the adults to catch up. In a Saturday morning booth at Lou's Diner, where the waitress refills your coffee before you ask, which is by one very reliable metric proof that some people are simply good. Some things are exactly what they appear to be, and the most important choices are almost never made in boardrooms. They are made in dark hallways in the rain at midnight when nobody is watching and everything is on the line, and the only question that matters is the simplest one. What kind of person are you going to be right now? Daniel Mercer answered that question on a Tuesday night in a Charlotte rainstorm. Everything else was just what followed.